with me today I have a member of the English Language Liturgical Consultation, ELC. It's Kevin McGinnell. Kevin, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Now,
good to be here.
Kevin, unlike the rest of us who only find out what's happening in the world scene in Christian liturgy, you know basically what's happening in English language liturgy from North America to Australia. So we're very glad to have you because of that width. I know that next year, 2017, Societas Liturgica is having its big every 4-year meeting. It's in Leuven in Belgium. And I know that you and a group of other scholars are going to do something on the whole notion of liturgical ordo and ecumenism. Could you give us some background to this?
I mean, given the fact that there's so many differences now between the use of English across the various churches and denominations, whereas, say, about 10 years ago we had a fairly commonality, we decided when we were in Reims to produce the first ELC statement, and that was a commitment to working together rather than in translation, but in anything else in the liturgical field where we could find this commonality, this sharedness.
Yeah, and of course that's the great statement on lectionaries.
That's it. And we realised that there isn't much hope at the moment, given the translation of the Roman Missal and all of the other service books of the other denominations of coming back together into a common text for several years. So what we thought was, moving on through the common lectionary, are there other things where we can share, where we can find a way of looking at things, perhaps more in scholarship than in actual practical liturgical text? And one of these is Ordo, because when we celebrate the liturgy as Christians across East and West, the two lungs of the Church, in every different grouping and denomination and style, there is a certain commonality. We use Scripture, for instance. There is an understanding of water at baptism, so therefore there's a question of symbol. There is the notion of what we mean by the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, the Mass. And while they are different, they are essentially looking towards the same thing, in that case the institution narrative in Corinthians. So what we wanted to do was to bring together, as part of the Societas thinking, as many people as we can who could actually begin to say, here is Ordo, here is a shape, here is a way of moving that we agree that we move together, so that we can then in a sense spark off from one another how we could perhaps eventually develop some more common texts. That would be a hope.
Well, I'm very glad you said that it's sad that we have gone away, because people like Paul Bradshaw have written about how when common worship was being produced for the Church of England, they deliberately looked to the 1973 Missal translation to try and form linguistic commonalities. And it's very sad that that has been lost. But when we talk about ordo, structure, shape, in a sense we're talking about isn't there a danger that that can become so generic, like water baptism, that it doesn't really help us? How does that help us towards common understanding?
The first thing is coming together to talk about things is an important thing.
Good, yeah, agreed.
Because the problem was before we worked together on text, we in a sense had a goal. That goal has been taken away from us by the divergence from text. So therefore, how do we sustain this understanding that we need to work together so that liturgically we move forward together? One of the questions that needs to be asked, and it's interesting in what sometimes people call paraliturgies, is how people, for instance, use symbols, proliferation of candles, lighting, colour, incense. And we need to say, are people understanding these things in their Christian roots? Or in one way, are they becoming the sort of gimmick that goes with aromatherapy? Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, it does. Yeah.
So what we want to say is we need to come together and talk and see, can we say we have things in common and recognise the things that we have in common? For instance, if you take the issue of baptism, the Ordo is clear that it is the use of water as a symbol. But there is a sense in which some may pour, some may immerse, some may use the sign of the cross in what's called the damp thumb baptism. And that's when we stand back and we say, well, hold on, have we actually really understood the depth of the symbol? So we're not going to try and explore all of the symbols, but rather, for instance, we're going to ask, are people thinking through what a symbol means in the best way? Have we a commonality there? Another example that we're perhaps going to use, we're trying to see what's the best thing, is the sign of peace. If you look at it in the Roman Rite, it's a preparation for communion. If you take it in other Protestant rites, it's, in a sense, the ending of the liturgy of the word. It's nearly a conclusion of a penitential experience. Does it go back to Matthew laying your gift before the altar, or is it an expression of Christ who is our peace? That's the sort of thing that we could say, when we do things, are we actually thinking them through in the same way?
And of course, the sign of peace is a very interesting one, because historically it's the kiss of peace. It's the greeting one another with the holy kiss in the Pauline letters. But actually, of course, in our society, it's become often just a handshake. And so it's interesting how literal is a symbol. But equally, of course, the thing is, by the very nature of actions, they're plurisemantic. So if we're shaking hands, it's hello, it's a certain amount of unity, it's a certain amount of common identification, but it's also reconciliation. So there's always a danger with symbols that we say it means this and not that. And we forget that the symbol is open. It's the language that we use to describe it that's often closed.
It will be very multivalent, absolutely. But one of the questions about, say, the peace, is if when the priest expresses the peace of the Lord be always with you, do people understand that they are then going to share the peace of Christ with one another rather than the shaking of hands? And some of this goes back to liturgical formation, certainly amongst our own in the Roman Church. How much of that was actually explained when the kiss of peace was introduced in the 60s or 70s? Which is why some people now say, well, we don't like it, because it has become just a human expression, whereas its depth is in the peace of Christ, again in the Pauline expressions.
But again, there's always the danger that we can have that we forget that there's no peace of Christ without the liturgical symbols that work well just as human symbols, as well as working within our formal memory as a Christian community. So if I'm going to share the peace of Christ, and we're going to share the peace of Christ with whether we shake hands or we do the sort of monastic nodding to one another, holding each other's elbows, there must also be the human expression, oi, I'm glad to see you.
That's absolutely true there. But if you say take the issue of water as a symbol in baptism, then you're talking there about how many people see that as regeneration, how many people see it as water, or how many people see it as that's what you do, as what they call a christening. It's just what you do.
Yes.
So it's the question now, particularly I suppose as well, where we're talking about so many people coming to church with many different layers of understanding and levels of spirituality and integration into the church. So that's why we want to go back to this question of, can we talk about an ordo that draws us in? So for instance, someone has said very simply that word always anticipates Eucharist, that we need to proclaim the word, the presence of Christ, so that we can then talk about the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, in the bread and wine.
It's interesting that you say that, because one of the curious things about, you mentioned the institution account in 1 Corinthians. The Eucharist, to use that phrase of Joachim Jeremias, the Eucharistic words of Jesus, the amount of ink that has been spilled on that problem over the centuries. And actually, literally the Eucharistic words of Jesus were never recorded. We don't know what prayer he said to the Father. It just said he blessed, he thanked. It was actually what was distinctive about the Jesus meal, the table of Jesus, was actually a way of breaking and a way of drinking. It was actually, it wasn't words that was distinctive. It certainly wasn't theology that was distinctive. The theology of Eucharist is a very standard Second Temple theology of Eucharist. What is distinctive is actually a sequence of actions, and all we have really in the so-called institution accounts are actually instructions for the structures of what to do.
And in a sense, that's where we want to look and see, is Ordo something that we share and and share with understanding, even if with differentiation?
Yeah.
Are we finding in that, I mean, 'cause this goes back to the bottom line question of the search for unity. Are we finding now, rather than just having the same words for the Gloria or the Sanctus, are we recognising deep down that in how we do things, that in participating in the same structure, we are actually, in a sense, sharing something quite very deep that we haven't understood as sharing before?
And certainly, if we look at just the distinctions in just the way the Gospel of Luke evolves, there are different accounts, how many cups in Luke. It shows that the different communities who used this Gospel, it was their understanding of the common Ordo that allowed them to alter the text. Kevin, let's hope that this new way of discussing the differences that keep Christians apart may ultimately help to have a more unified and enriched liturgy. Thanks for coming.
You're very welcome.